Welcome to News Channel. Dear friends, the former British Army commander said that Ukraine is at great risk of collapsing its defense line and failing in the face of Russia's multi-directional attacks. Accordingly, retired General Sir Richard Barons, who once held the position of leader of the British Army's Strategic Command, said that Ukraine will come to a point where it feels it cannot win this year. At that point, what reason do Ukrainians have to fight and die to defend things they cannot protect? Ukraine has not yet reached such a point, but its army is depleted. Serious ammunition, soldiers and air defense systems. Ukraine's large-scale counteroffensive last year failed, failing to achieve its goal of removing Russian forces from areas they controlled. Thus, there are more and more assertions that Ukraine's strategic failure is approaching, and even Western generals and experts can no longer hide it. The Russian army is preparing for an offensive operation in the summer. Mr. Sir Richard Barons commented that the shape of this campaign is quite clear. We are seeing Russian forces encroaching on the front lines, taking advantage of a 5-to-1 advantage in artillery, ammunition and manpower. At the same time, increase the use of new weapons. Among Russia's new weapons are glide bombs of all sizes, which were conventional bombs back then. The Soviet Union was equipped with guidance wings and navigation systems. Gliding bombs that can weigh tons are destroying Ukraine's defense system. Sir Richard Barons predicted, sometime in the summer we will see a large-scale Russian offensive aimed at more than small attacks to penetrate Ukrainian lines. Russian forces can break through and flood areas where Ukraine cannot stop them. Last year Russia knew exactly where Ukraine had the ability to counterattack, including the tip from Zaporizhia south to the Azov coast. They planned appropriate defenses and successfully stopped Ukraine's advance. The current situation is completely different when Ukraine cannot predict where Russia will attack next. According to Jack Watling, an expert at the British Royal Defence Research Institute, said one of the challenges Ukraine faces is that Russia can choose where to deploy its forces because Ukraine has to protect the entire very long front line. However, due to lack of forces, Ukraine cannot deploy troops across the front line. Mr. Jack Watling predicted, Ukraine will lose more territory in Russia's next attack. The question is, how many and which municipalities will be affected? This is why the Ukrainian general is asking the Kyiv government to capture 500,000 recruits to fill the frontline defense system. However, this plan is facing many difficulties. NATO countries also plan to send troops deep into Ukraine's interior, so that Ukraine can concentrate its forces, with hundreds of thousands of troops pushing to the Donbass front line to fight Russia. However, this plan could spark a third world war. Military experts say, Ukraine's northeastern province of Kharkov is definitely a key target that Russia is aiming for. Russia has recently been attacking Kharkov every day, but Ukrainian air defense in Kharkov is not capable of preventing coordinated attack tactics between drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles targeting here. In fact, comparing the two potential areas that Russia is forced to take, Odessa and Kharkov, the Kharkov area is easier for Russia to attack because this place is only about 29 kilometers from the Russian border. Ukraine could still survive if Kharkiv fell, but this would be a catastrophic blow to the country's morale and economy. Fighting in the Donbass region, including Donetsk and Lugansk provinces, has been going on since 2014 when pro-Russian separatists seized power there. In October 2022 Russia annexed Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kharkiv into the territory following a referendum there. The Donbass region is where most of the fighting has taken place over the past 18 months. The most controversial thing is that Ukraine has devoted large resources to entrench itself in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, but these two cities have fallen into Russian hands. The fall of these two cities caused Ukraine to lose a significant number of soldiers with the best combat capabilities. General Christopher Cavalli, leader of the U.S. military's European Command, warned on April 10, unless the country transfers more weapons and ammunition, Ukraine will be overwhelmed by Russian firepower up to 10 times on the battlefield. The question is that the West has given more than $200 billion in aid to Ukraine, an amount several times greater than Russia's defense budget in a year. Yet Ukraine always complains. Is it true that it lacks artillery shells and weapons? Commander of U.S. forces in Europe, Christopher Cavalli, said that the size of the Russian army has increased by 15% compared to the time the Ukraine conflict broke out. Russia last year increased the number of troops on the front line from 360,000 to 470,000 people. At the end of 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree, increasing the maximum number of soldiers in the Russian armed forces by 170,000 people, so the total number is 1.32 million soldiers. Accordingly, regardless of the outcome of the conflict with Ukraine, Russia will become more powerful and more dangerous to the West than before. General Christopher Cavalli admitted, Russia has been particularly successful in rebuilding the army. Most notable is the tank refurbishment, repair and manufacturing activities. Russia still deploys many tanks into combat as in the first phase of the conflict. Strategic forces, long-range air warfare, cyber warfare, aerospace and electronic warfare did not suffer losses in the conflict with Ukraine. The Russian Air Force remains largely intact. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Michael Campbell also commented, the Russian army has almost completely recovered after heavy losses in the conflict with Ukraine. Through the assessments of Western officials and generals, we realize that Ukraine's psychological warfare game is clearly demonstrated. If Ukraine wins, it goes without saying, the entire Ukrainian media system will be fake all day. If Ukraine loses, it will always be the same. Russia suffers heavy losses. And here is the second case. Even though Ukraine is losing painfully on the battlefield, but Ukraine will always say, Russia suffered heavy losses. So, if the losses were heavy, why was Russia able to completely recover its troops and become even stronger than before? It is clear that Russia's losses were exaggerated by Ukraine many times, while Ukraine's losses were hidden and minimized many times. If Ukraine suffered few losses, they wouldn't have had to find ways to recruit women, wouldn't have had to lower the age of recruits, or even force disabled and sick people to go to the front lines. This is something we can deduce regardless of what the Ukrainian media says. Currently, an important aid package worth $60 billion is still stuck in the U.S. Congress after months of debate. Ukraine now depends on unmanned aerial vehicles to block Russia's advance. But this type of weapon cannot replace what Kyiv needs. General Christopher Cavalli warned, if the U.S. does not continue to support, Ukraine will run out of artillery and anti-aircraft missiles in a very short time. Faced with the serious loss of military numbers, the Ukrainian parliament voted a resolution to mobilize the entire population to join the army, and at the same time extend military service indefinitely. 36-month waiver for soldiers. Thus, the number of conscripts whose service term is about to expire must now continue to stay in the army. Thus, the first group of soldiers who attacked Azov was almost completely destroyed by Russia. The short-haired soldiers were overdue for service and asked to be discharged. Now, according to the new law, Ukraine conscripts all long-haired soldiers. Last week, the short-haired soldiers were extremely dissatisfied, so they deserted en masse by waiting for the Russian army to arrive and hastily waved white flags, begging to surrender. Too bad the Kyiv regime must be replaced by long-haired soldiers. Over the past 3 years, Ukrainian soldiers have changed from short hair to short hair, and now to long hair. I wonder what hair will come next. What a tragedy. Dear friends, the top U.S. commander in Europe recently rejected Ukraine's claim about major losses of the Russian Air Force and stated, in fact, many of the country's military capabilities are still intact after more than 2 years of war. Fight in Ukraine. Accordingly, General Christopher Cavalli, head of the U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, stated in a hearing at the House Armed Services Committee on April 10 that, "We do not see Russia's significant losses in the air sector, especially its strategic and long-range aviation squadrons. Russia's strategic air forces, cyber capabilities, space capabilities and electronic warfare capabilities are not lost. The Russian Air Force lost some aircraft but only about 10% of its fleet." General Christopher Cavalli's statements poured cold water on Ukraine when it contradicted a series of Ukrainian statements about large military losses. Russia on the battlefield. This makes Kyiv worried, because it will cause huge psychological impacts. First, it will discourage the aggressive Western hawks who want to use the Ukraine card to defeat the Russian bear. This faction is actually discussing sending large NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia directly. Because this faction no longer believes in the capabilities of the Kyiv proxy army. Second, it also makes Western public opinion angry because their taxpayer money is pouring into Ukraine without getting anything in return, so it will cause an anti-war impact. Western people don't protest against the government, because it affects their wallets. War investment is ineffective, the economy is bad and life is difficult, so it's extremely unfortunate that they protest everywhere like this. The sight of European farmers using tank trucks to carry waste and spray it all over the streets. It's no longer a strange sight. Third, the psychology of the Ukrainian army and people will be severely negatively affected. Once upon a time, they eagerly joined the army to fight Russia because they believed that the leaders of Kyiv and the West would give it. The Russian army was defeated, but now not only did Russia not lose, but most of Ukraine's friendly troops were destroyed. Ukrainian media can no longer hide those huge losses. The increasing number of protests against conscription taking place, even with violence, is proof of that. The American general's comments will further accelerate the disintegration of the army and government. Ukrainian government established by the West after the Maidan coup. Mr. Wolfram Weimer, editor-in-chief of the German Welle newspaper, recently said that the Ukrainian president's insecurity and fear can be seen when looking into his eyes. Obviously due to the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces are currently in a losing position. Kyiv it is certainly felt among Western allies everywhere, not only in Germany. Public opinion is changing in the direction of a decrease in the number of people who support the continuation of armed conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Donald Trump, who has a significant chance of becoming U.S. president, declared that he intends to resolve the Ukraine crisis in one day by stop military support for Kyiv. Previously, his publication The Guardian reported that British Foreign Secretary James Cameron met former President Donald Trump in the US and tried to convince him of the need to gain support for Ukraine in Parliament, but the ministry's efforts the British chief failed. In a related development, the President of Ukraine recently called on France to help the Ukrainian armed forces defend in 2024. The Kyiv regime hopes to hold out until 2025, after which the Ukrainian army will launch the attack and end in victory. Representatives of the Kyiv authorities spoke out about such plans at the talks, asking Western allies for help to survive this year. It seems that Ukraine is opening a beautiful dream before the nightmare comes. If French troops officially enter Ukraine, it will be a total war, not a special military campaign. And that could be the end for the West or the end for everyone. Ukraine is also asking the West to provide air and missile defense systems, them to reduce damage from air attacks. But the key problem is that the industry cannot produce more missiles than it can handle, and the West does not have much confidence in its strike capabilities. Ukraine this year. Or next year. Many military experts believe that the Ukrainian armed forces are suffering too many losses. This cannot be hidden anymore. Kyiv needs to think about ending the conflict so as not to lose more territory. Many U.S. officials have also voiced pessimism about the scenario of the Ukrainian army collapsing in the context of increasingly scarce foreign aid. Ukraine's position on the battlefield has been weakened in recent months by a severe lack of capabilities. The situation became more and more serious when the U.S. Congress stalled the approval of a new military aid package for Ukraine. It sounds like if there is aid, Ukraine will still fight. But if there is no aid, Ukraine will ask. Lose. Does this sound familiar to you again? Returning to the battlefield situation, Ukrainian President Zelensky predicted that a new large-scale Russian attack could take place at the end of May or June. U.S. General Christopher Cavalier said that Russia has sought to compensate for most of the battlefield losses in Ukraine, and this process is happening at a much faster pace than expected. A senior U.S. general said, Russia's current military size is even larger than before the conflict in Ukraine broke out. Meanwhile, Ukraine mainly retreats to defense to limit losses from large-scale Russian attacks. Ukraine is looking to fill the army's huge personnel shortage with a new military mobilization law. Accordingly, the Ukrainian National Assembly on April 11 passed a bill to mobilize new recruits to recruit hundreds of thousands of reinforcements for the army, reducing the age of mobilization from 27 to 25. This bill also removes the provisions for military recruitment for soldiers after 36 months of military service, including 18 months on the front line. Thus, Ukraine has decided to dry out the final battle with Russia on the basis of mobilizing new recruits by reducing the military enlistment age. On the other hand, forcing soldiers to continue fighting at the front and not allowing them to return to rest. And a large number of soldiers in the border areas and deep in the inland provinces will also be recruited for this decisive battle when NATO troops jump in to take their place. However, a senior official in the Russian Defense Ministry said Ukraine's new counteroffensive plan would certainly end in complete disaster. At the same time, Ukraine's final defeat will be the beginning of a peace process on Russia's terms. Russian ambassador to the United Nations Vasily Nebenzia said the West must prepare for discussions on Ukraine's unconditional surrender in the near future. Russia will not participate in the meeting scheduled to take place in Switzerland on June 15 to 16. Official representative of the Russian Foreign Ministry Maria Zakharova said, Russia has no intention of participating in such a conference even if invited. Awake. This speech will be dedicated to promoting the Zelensky ultimatum formula, even though the Swiss organizers pretend that they are looking for a common denominator in the peace initiatives of the different countries. Ambassador Maria Zakharova also added that Switzerland has lost its neutral status as a negotiating platform. She noted, Western countries do not need peace but just a ceasefire in Ukraine. It seems that the West is still trying to surround and isolate Russia at all costs. At the same time, the Russians believe that the West is looking for a plan to delay troops to continue buying time for Ukraine to mobilize enough troops to attack Russia and restore its strength. Perhaps this Russia has understood after being deceived by the West twice after the Minsk Conference 1 and Minsk 2. Russia also no longer trusts Switzerland because in reality Switzerland has revealed its true form as a pseudo-neutral country. In fact, this is just a vault created by the West and attached to it with a neutral name to trick all humanity into depositing money there to benefit the West. Today's program is paused. If you find it interesting, please subscribe, share and ring the bell to receive the latest notifications. Hello and see you again in the next programs.